Today at the National Press Club, the President of the Business Council of Australia, Catherine Livingstone. With businesses great and small under threat from start-up companies and the internet changing the way for commerce, Catherine Livingstone will outline the policy agenda for business in an age of disruption. That's today at the National Press Club.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club for today's National Australia Bank Address. Today is a particularly memorable day for the club, not just because it's the first occasion on which our guest has addressed the club, but also because it marks the final event with which we'll be involved with the National Australia Bank, which has been our sponsor, our principal sponsor for the past decade. It's been a tremendously positive relationship, I have to say. I'd also say that we live in difficult times in the media, and the reality is that without some level of external support, we would not be able to conduct the 70-odd events such as this, major speaker events that we do conduct here at the National Press Club. On behalf of my board and all of our members, I'd just like to express our great appreciation for the tremendous support and assistance that the bank has offered us over that period, that decade. Now to our guest today, and as I said at the outset, this is the first occasion on which she has addressed the club. Catherine Livingstone has, I think, as everyone in this room knows, and I'm sure as many of our viewers know, has carved out an extremely impressive career in the business sector. She's the current Chairman of Telstra, a member of the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council, President of the Australian Museum Trust, a former Chairman of CSIRO, a former Managing Director of Cochlear, one of Australia's great companies. And the list goes on. I'm not going to mention any more, but it's in her role as President of the Business Council of Australia that she joins us today. She spearheads, that organisation spearheads the business sector, big businesses certainly, campaign for continuing economic reform in the run-up, certainly, to this year's budget. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome our guest today, the President of the Business Council of Australia, Catherine Livingstone.
Well, thank you very much, Laurie, and thank you to everyone who's taken the time to come here today. In 2 weeks' time, the Treasurer will address the Press Club, having brought down the 2015-16 federal budget. For some weeks now, as many of you might know, I've been arguing that we need to decouple the process of major policy reform from the federal budget process and instead address it through the rigour of the Cabinet process with analysis and debate and appropriate consultation with the community. This is in no way intended to diminish the urgent need for the growth in expenditure to be reined in, but policy reform tackled only through the lens of the budget process is clearly failing the community. So I'm not here today to talk about the budget. Instead, I would like to talk about a 10-year plan for adaptation and growth. The intergenerational report tells us that we do need a new plan for the country, not just a process to improve our fiscal position. Unfortunately, while the IGR presented us with the challenges of expenditure, it did not confront the context for change, that extraordinary disruption which is now upon us. We're experiencing what physicists would call a phase change. So in our economic environment, where previously held assumptions about causal factors and relationships were constant, they no longer seem to hold. So we see debates around secular stagnation, countries issuing bonds at negative interest rates, and weak investment in spite of the very low real and nominal interest rates. So even the recent past is no longer a basis for predicting the future, and we're in a constant state of revision of what constitutes normal. As fast as we gain understanding, the disruptive forces seem to change the rules. So given this context, I'd like to canvass 4 things. 1, the underlying drivers of disruption. Then the implications for policy and on our reliance on the traditional growth tenets of productivity, participation and population. Then the need for a fundamental reset in the philosophical underpinning of our major spending programs, that's health, education and retirement income. And finally, the need to reframe our leadership model, which is so obviously struggling with the task at hand. These themes provide the building blocks of the plan. So first to the forces of disruption. As a soon-to-be-released publication from McKinsey states, This is no ordinary disruption. We've reached the point where a confluence of trends, the digital disruption, the shift in the locus of economic activity, globalisation and demographic change, each of which on their own would rank among the strongest economic forces the global economy has seen, but combined, they're casting our world into a completely different reality. At the heart of this disruption is connectivity, mass connectivity. This connectivity has enabled human-generated data and now machine-generated data to flood through our global networks of copper and fibre, and combined with orders of magnitude increases in computing power, the what and the who is possible to know is almost limitless and in real time. We thought that connectivity enabled in the mid-90s through the fixed-line internet and browser technology was disruptive. And that was until 2007, when the mobile internet became a reality with the first smartphone. But that's nothing compared with the disruption we'll see with the advent of the Internet of Things. Estimates vary, but by 2030 there might be 50 billion devices connected to the internet, and the average home is expected to have more than 20 such connected devices. So that's your fridge, your front door, your security, quite apart from your various communication devices. So why is connectivity so disruptive? Because innovation happens most powerfully at the interface. The more interfaces, the greater the potential for innovation, and the more connectivity, the more interfaces. And these interfaces can be human to human, human to machine, and increasingly machine to machine. Connectivity is changing the power relationships between consumers and companies. It's fragmenting supply chains and disrupting business models. It's changing the nature of work and of workplaces and the shape of cities and urban environments. On the positive side, it's also opening up new possibilities and new frontiers of discovery. Just let me give you some data points and some implications of what's going on. So in the US, 40% of the workforce, or 53 million people, are now freelancing through new business models like Airbnb, Airtasker, Uber. So what is this doing to patterns of demand where income security is uncertain and long-term expenditure commitments can't be made? Online markets are supplanting companies as an organising force, representing a material risk transfer from companies to individuals. So Uber doesn't own a single vehicle, Airbnb doesn't own a single bed. There's growing momentum in the sharing economy, of course made possible by connectivity, and that's as part of the broader theme of the circular economy, which is very good news for sustainability, but threatening for business models which are predicated on ever-growing consumption. Machines are now learning. Advances in artificial intelligence and neural computing, combined with the connectivity possible through cloud computing, mean that machines can now be said to learn, and it turns out that they learn better together, which of course is possible in a connected cloud environment. Just last week, Google announced that its search algorithm will prioritise mobile-friendly websites when people search using their smartphone or their tablet. Desktop-only sites will still appear, but they'll be ranked lower. So what will this do to Australia's competitiveness when 66% of the nation's websites are not optimised for mobiles, including 51.5% of ASX 200 companies? And finally, on competitiveness, connectivity has enabled global supply chains, with 70% of global trade now in intermediate goods and services and capital goods, not in finished goods. So while we were intent on preserving an automotive industry producing finished vehicles, other countries recognised the opportunity in manufacturing components and supplying them into global niche. No business model is immune from impact, given these trends, and no country's business model is immune either. So my contention is that the disruption of a hyper-connected world has made it that many of our policy settings are simply not fit for purpose. They have exceeded their design tolerance limits. So that takes me to my second theme, and that's the 3 Ps. If we are to adapt to these disruptive forces, we must do more than rely on the simplistic exhortations to focus on productivity, participation, and population as the route to growth. The fact is that these are lag indicators and are not policy amenable in their own right. So take productivity. In this age of disruption, productivity is achieved through innovation. Innovation requires the mobilisation of a complete and interdependent ecosystem. So, for example, this includes building of knowledge infrastructure through both research and business, skilled workforce, creative workplaces, business models built around the customer and competition, engagement in global supply chains, culture of experimentation and entrepreneurship, contestability of government services, and government acting as a demanding customer in its procurement activities, to mention just a few elements of that ecosystem. So it's time for government, the union movement and business to come to a meeting of the minds as to what improving productivity actually means. Use the word, and it's incumbent on people to engage in the complexity and the detail of what it entails. Then we have participation, and we talk endlessly about participation, but a precondition for participation is that the underlying jobs be there. So while we're debating the minimum wage and penalty rates, jobs are moving to Airtasker or being replaced by machines. If 47% of total US employment is at risk of being automated using artificial intelligence, we need to move urgently from a discussion about protecting the jobs of today to creating the jobs of the future. This includes ensuring that there's a skilled workforce and the attributes required by business. Precision welders and robotics mechanics will be much more useful in the growing advanced manufacturing sector than yet more law graduates for whom there are no jobs. There is no more disturbing evidence of the potential dislocating impact of the disruptive forces than the fact that we now sit with around 400,000 young people who are neither in work nor full-time study. So this would suggest that it's not a participation problem that we have, but it's a jobs and skills match problem that we have on our hands. Population, the third P. Australia's population has grown at the fastest rate among major OECD economies. It's grown by about 25% since the year 2000, and its composition has changed dramatically. But the population policy imperative underpinning growth can't be confined to the level of the population and migration quota settings. It must include planning and prioritisation of infrastructure, design and livability of our cities and regions, affordability of housing, and the preservation of our environment. If these aspects are not integral to a discussion about population, an increase in population may actually result in a net cost and therefore a drag on growth. So the three Ps probably lend themselves to a speech in their own right, but they're an example of how our lack of nuance, lack of sophistication, lack of granularity, and lack of context in policy design are letting us down. Nothing short of a philosophical and mindset shift is required. So let me turn to the three public policy areas that exemplify the degree of change required. That's health, education, and retirement income. And I've selected these because addressing them will have a catalytic effect on our capacity to respond to the forces of disruption, and they also relate directly to the three Ps. They are the input lead indicators to the abstract lag indicators. They are central to the human interface with disruption and will determine whether individuals can take advantage of it or be displaced by it. If we manage these properly with the required degree of policy granularity and design sophistication, our productivity, the contribution of population growth, and our capacity to increase participation will improve dramatically. It will take a decade of transition, but it will mean that we are designing policies that are fit for purpose for 2025 and beyond. Happily, they also represent 43% of Commonwealth and state government expenditure, so getting them right will be the best way to securing a better fiscal situation. I'm not going to talk about the technical policy change that's needed in each of these areas. That's what we always tend to do. We begin with a solution, like a price signal or a fee change or an eligibility change, and it's the wrong place to start. We have to start by asking ourselves, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What outcomes are we seeking? And what are we trying to move from and to? If we don't adopt this architecture in our approach to the big policy issues, we'll continue to have the community reject what they perceive as disconnected and short-sighted interventions. So health. In health, we need to change the mindset from one of fixing people when they get sick to enabling them to stay healthy for as long as possible. Put bluntly, the focus needs to shift from the second 50 years of life to the first 50 years. That is, preventing things that are preventable and preserving constrained resources for those which are not. For example, the emerging research in the microbiome, and that's the 1.5 to 2 kilos of flora or bugs which reside predominantly in our gut, suggests that the first 1,000 days of life are even more determinant than we realised in terms of genetic expression, a robust immune system, and a lifetime avoidance of conditions such as arthritis and obesity. It is really quite extraordinary research, and the progress made in the last 5 years has huge implications for our health. So these advances in science will allow us to predict and prevent conditions and can be applied in conjunction with technologies which empower consumers to take control of their health and from a very early age. This means that we need to move the system from a transaction fee-for-service model to a fee-for-outcome model, one that offers providers the incentives to keep people well as part of a more shared responsibility for health. We must shift our philosophy from a provider and institution-driven system to a person or customer-driven system. And as NIB's Mark Fitzgibbon says, this will facilitate an explicit conversation as a community of what we're prepared to trade off to accommodate increases in spending on health. A customer-driven system would also move us from an institutionalised setting for dying to a more dignified end of life. So why is it that 70% of people in Australia want to die at home, but only 14% of this have their wish fulfilled? Turning to education and training. Here, we need to move away from the notion that work is something we begin after a long period of study to one where work is integrated with learning. The philosophical shift is to move from a system which has a rigid discontinuity between education and work to one which is more of a continuum, enabling simultaneous engagement in education and work for all and from year 11 at school. The discontinuity between education and work was perhaps relevant when, for most, formal education ended at 15, only 10% of students went to university, and degrees were 3 years in duration. It's not helpful now, with over 30% of students at university and degrees of 4 or 5 years. Given that the late teens and early 20s are a period of very high innovative thinking, not to have those young people participating in the workplace to some degree is a waste of intellectual capital and a loss of productive capacity. Coupled with this philosophical shift would be a more explicit recognition of the stock of skills intrinsic to employability. Given that an estimated 75% of the fastest growing occupations, including those in the creative industries and humanities, that these will require STEM-related skills and knowledge, the imperative for introducing these foundational skills into the primary and pre-primary curricula should be unassailable. And by STEM skills, I mean maths and science, yes, but also computer coding, computational thinking, design thinking, and problem solving. As it stands in Australia, the gap between the digital literacy of our young people and that of our competitor nations is increasing. If we want increased productivity and participation, we will urgently need to start on a 10-year plan to close that gap, and this will be essential to tackling the structural youth unemployment issue that we have. In order to achieve these philosophical shifts, we also need to move from our national preoccupation with class sizes to a national obsession with teacher quality, teaching standards, learning methods, and curricula. Finally, on the so-called retirement income system, the philosophical shift we need is that we need to rethink the current concept of retirement. Over the 20th century and into the 21st, retirement has moved from being seen as the brief interregnum between finishing work and dying, usually a period of 5 or so years, then to a reward for a lifetime of hard work, to a point now where it's often planned as a goal in its own right, as an entitlement to an extended phase of life marked by a focus on leisure and underwritten by access to the age pension. Through entrenching the concept of retirement, we've again created an artificial discontinuity, this time between work and the mature phase of life, and have compounded the problem by extending what was intended to be a financial safety net to a broader entitlement. A fundamental change in philosophy would underpin a new social contract between government and citizens as they age. If we think that the only task is scrimping and saving on eligibility and concessions versus harnessing the potential and the very real wish that people have to continue to contribute, we will have missed the point. This is about valuing people and about recognising the dignity and belonging that flow from continuing to have an appropriate form of paid work. It means a paradigm shift about people working longer and training later in their life as the types of jobs available and the type of work that they can do change. The role of government would be to provide an adequate safety net, but more importantly, to assist people to become and stay independent by participating fully in the economy. So, to recap, I've proposed a fundamental change in philosophy in the three core areas of health, education, and retirement. These are complex policy areas which have inevitable intersects with the tax and the federation reform, but too often we are seduced by their complexity and trapped by their detail. I do passionately believe that the starting point to navigating our way through this complexity is to gain agreement on philosophy. The right philosophy also offers the best road to a degree of bipartisanship and an end to damaging and costly policy reversals. I am in no sense underestimating the degree of difficulty here, nor suggesting that the proposed reorientation of philosophy is the answer. It is, however, the first step to asking the right question. It's difficult to convey the level of anxiety and urgency we should have in the face of the disruptive forces that I started today by describing. The ageing of our population, combined with the impact of hyperconnectivity, will literally overwhelm us if we don't rapidly increase our rate of adaptation. And I'm not exaggerating when I make this point. The discussions at the Davos Forum in January, for example, were very sobering. Many country and business leaders expressed real fear about their ability to manage the rate of job displacement and its impact on communities. They're afraid because they feel unable to imagine the future given the rate of change. They're also afraid that the rate of change of technology now exceeds our capacity to adapt to it. But adapt we must. If we embark on a 10-year transition now, we might just have the policy frameworks fit for purpose by 2025. If we do not, we face certain loss of both standard of living and social cohesion. The degree of philosophical shift I've described will require extraordinary levels of leadership from government, from business, and from the community. In the first instance, however, the leadership must come from our elected representatives, and this includes the opposition, minor parties and independents, who are all part of our governance structure. The role of these representatives is to provide leadership, not to be re-elected. It must be leadership characterised not by positional power and, as Jennifer Hewitt notes, a preoccupation with the political present, but by strong personal values, consistency, respect and transparency. Instead of dealing with hollow insertions of certainty, this leadership must admit to doubt while providing hope. It's the role of political leaders to engage with the community and mobilise the aspirations that we have for ourselves, our children and our grandchildren. These leaders must lead the conversations on why we need to adapt through a new social contract, and they must frame the transition path over the next decade. And the community is absolutely ready for this conversation. Research undertaken by the Business Council has revealed that the community knows that we've had a privileged position, and 83% understand that the worsening situation will affect them. Above all, they want to know that the risks they see are being managed. However, the concerning sentiment, which has come through strongly, is that the community has a very low expectation of the ability of political leaders to manage the huge changes underway, to provide a strategy and to execute. Only 13% believe the management of our finances is good, and for an alarming 18%, the competency of government ranks as a major concern. The researchers noted that this level of concern is unprecedented in over 30 years of polling in Australia. This loss of reputation and trust in our governance model has profound implications for our democracy. We're already experiencing the first-order effects: one-term governments, minority governments, opinion poll to opinion poll decision-making, and disruptive policy reversals with newly elected governments claiming as ostensible mandates what is actually an expression of underlying frustration and cynicism. Filling this void, we also have, as one commentator so aptly put it, the emergence of a derivative market in politics through the media and particularly social media. Social media is amplifying the disconnect between the community's expectations of leadership and the observed behaviour. This turbulence represents a huge loss of value to the country. Such a loss would be unacceptable in a business context. It's even more unacceptable when it comes to the national interest. So before we talk about new philosophical basis for major policy areas and the negotiation of a social contract, it's clear that confidence must be restored in the governance model for the country. From the government of the day, there needs to be evidence of respect for process, particularly the cabinet process, and of the rigorous review of and community consultation over policy changes and then action within appropriate timeframes. For those elected representatives not part of the government of the day, there needs to be constructive debate and probing of policies. But no one has given the opposition, minor parties and independents the mandate to obstruct. It's harder to be thoughtful in opposition than to obstruct, but deliver the latter and not the former is to abrogate the critical role of opposition in our country. Above all, we need to see that the personal priorities and values of our elected representatives are congruent with what is truly in the national interest, not in their personal interest in being re-elected. Ironically, greater transparency reduces electoral vulnerability, and confidence in competence is a major driver of the national vote. This is the leadership challenge at this time of no ordinary disruption. While there is much talk about the need for a new narrative, what does this actually mean? It's not a new marketing strategy. It's not a more compelling to-do list. We need a transition plan which reconciles the concerns people have, given the rapidly changing environment confronting us, with our hopes for the future, for ourselves and for our children. Leadership has to define the path between the current reality and future aspiration, one that requires working through these core policy areas, approaching them from a different philosophical starting point and setting them on a 10-year path, because that's how long it will take, to make them fit for purpose, to preserve our well-being as a nation. Thank you.
Catherine Livingstone, thank you very much for your speech today. Let me begin a round of questions from our media members by asking the first one myself. If the community is ready and looking for a new social contract, is that starting to dawn, do you think, on our politicians? Is there a level of agreement, if only unofficial, that we do need to do something? And if that is the case, or even if it isn't, how frustrated is the business community becoming with this seeming sort of ongoing inability to drive at least, if not all, certainly some major policy changes, the sort of continuing gridlock or lack of bipartisanship?
Thanks, Laurie. Well, I think what we're dealing with is a very reactive and incremental situation, and it's hard for the community to understand because there's no context. Things come from left field, and they come suddenly with no warning. People need context and they need time. You get time by talking through issues and asking the questions. I think what we're saying is really important to start asking the questions and keep driving until you're quite confident you're asking the right question, and then you can start designing the appropriate policy frameworks. Concerningly, I think politicians think that they need to have all the answers, and the expectation that any one or even a small group of people can have all the answers in the complexity that we're dealing with today is unrealistic. But I think it is realistic that they start asking the right questions and then listening to the community and absorbing the answers.
Let me open it up now to my fellow members. Sophie Morris has the next question.
Sophie Morris from the Saturday paper. Thank you for your thoughts on the next 10 years. One issue you didn't touch on was climate change, and I'm curious, to what extent do you see climate change and the policy response as an economic challenge? And what do you make of the Climate Change Authority's recommendations that to match the targets already offered by comparable countries, Australia would need to reduce emissions by 30% by 2025 and 40 to 60% by 2030? What sort of